¿Alguna vez has sentido que estás hecho para algo más grande, pero que algo invisible te detiene cada vez que intentas avanzar? ¿Te has preguntado por qué otros con menos talento logran más que tú? Tal vez no te falta inteligencia, ni capacidad, ni suerte. Tal vez lo único que te falta es un conjunto claro de reglas mentales para transformar tu vida desde dentro. Hoy te revelaré las 10 reglas que Napoleon Hill, uno de los pensadores más influyentes en el desarrollo personal y la ciencia del éxito, nos dejó como legado. Pero lo haré como nunca antes lo escuchaste. Sin filtros, con ejemplos reales, estrategias psicológicas poderosas y una pizca de psicología oscura para despertar tu máximo potencial. Comenta ahora mismo: hoy elijo dominar mi destino, no ser víctima de él. ¿Lo hiciste? Bien. Porque lo que sigue podría sacudir tu forma de ver el mundo. Napoleon Hill no hablaba de suerte, hablaba de principios universales, reglas mentales que, si las sigues con disciplina, pueden cambiar tu realidad por completo. Pero cuidado, porque también te enfrentarán cara a cara con tu oscuridad. El precio del éxito no es bajo, pero vale cada gota de esfuerzo. La primera regla: domina tu mente o ella te dominará a ti. Esto no es poesía, es ciencia. La mente humana es una máquina de crear realidades. Lo que crees, lo creas. Lo que temes, lo atraes. Hill lo decía claro. Lo que la mente del hombre puede concebir y creer, lo puede lograr. Pero, ¿qué pasa si tu mente está entrenada para dudar, para temer, para sabotearte? Imagina que tu mente es un caballo salvaje. Si no lo entrenas, te arrastra hacia el abismo. Pero si lo dominas, te lleva a la cima. ¿Cómo se hace eso? Con repetición, disciplina y, sobre todo, vigilando tus pensamientos como un guardia en la puerta de un castillo. Cada vez que pienses «no puedo», sustitúyelo por «aún no, sé cómo pero lo lograré». Cada vez que tu mente diga «esto es muy difícil», responde «perfecto, porque los fáciles no valen la pena». Esa es la guerra silenciosa que debes ganar todos los días. La segunda regla: ten un deseo ardiente, no un capricho, no una fantasía, un deseo ardiente, un propósito tan fuerte que te quite el sueño. ¿Por qué? Porque la mediocridad se alimenta de deseos tibios. La grandeza exige pasión. Hill decía que todo logro comienza con un deseo ardiente. El deseo es el combustible del logro, pero también es el fuego que consume tus excusas. Cuando deseas algo, de verdad, no aceptas no como respuesta. Si no sabes cómo lograrlo, aprendes. Si no tienes recursos, los creas. Si te cierran una puerta, derribas la pared. Ejemplo: Thomas Edison. Le dijeron que era lento. Fracasó 1000 veces antes de crear la bombilla. ¿Y qué lo mantuvo vivo? El deseo ardiente de iluminar el mundo. No fue suerte, fue obsesión. Comenta ahora: mi deseo es más fuerte que mis excusas. Escríbelo. Repite eso hoy 10 veces, y verás cómo cambia tu energía. La tercera regla: crea una imagen clara y definida de lo que quieres. Aquí entra la psicología oscura, porque el cerebro no sabe diferenciar entre lo real y lo imaginado. Si te visualizas fracasando, tu cuerpo se entrena para fallar. Si te visualizas triunfando, tu mente empieza a trabajar en cómo hacerlo posible. Pero tienes que ser específico. No digas, quiero ser rico. Di, quiero ganar 10,000 euros al mes, trabajando en lo que amo, ayudando a otros y viviendo en libertad. Esa claridad es el imán. La vaguedad es el enemigo del éxito. Cierra los ojos. Visualízate logrando eso que tanto deseas. Escucha los sonidos, siente la emoción, imagina los detalles. Esa imagen es tu mapa. Sin mapa, estás perdido. La cuarta regla: rodéate de una mente maestra. Napoleon Hill descubrió que los grandes logros no se hacen en soledad. Se logran cuando te rodeas de personas que piensan como tú, que te impulsan, que te retan. Pero también, y aquí va la advertencia, debes alejarte de los ladrones de energía, de los que se quejan, critican y dudan de ti. Eso no es egoísmo, es estrategia de vida. Tu entorno moldea tu destino. Cambia tus amigos si es necesario. Únete a comunidades que hablen de éxito, mentalidad, disciplina. No tienes que cortar con nadie, pero sí poner límites. Porque si estás rodeado de perdedores que se justifican todo el día, ¿cómo vas a pensar como un ganador? La quinta regla. Toma decisiones rápidas y firmes. La duda es el asesino silencioso de los sueños. Hill descubrió que las personas exitosas deciden rápido y cambian lentamente. ¿Por qué? Porque confían en su intuición. Porque no necesitan la aprobación de otros. Porque saben que la indecisión alimenta el miedo. Así que decide. Decide hoy empezar. Decide hoy actuar. No esperes al lunes, al 1 del mes, al año nuevo. Decide ahora. Comenta otra frase poderosa. Decido avanzar, aunque tenga miedo. Porque el que decide, toma el timón de su vida. Hasta aquí llega el primer capítulo. Y esto es solo el principio. Si esto te hizo reflexionar, si algo en tu mente despertó, dale me gusta ahora. Comenta una frase que te inspire y comparte este video con alguien que necesita escucharlo. En el próximo capítulo, exploraremos las reglas más intensas. Cómo usar el autosabotaje a tu favor, cómo manipular tus emociones para alcanzar el éxito, y cómo reprogramar tu subconsciente. Y sí, hablaremos de control mental, porque quien domina su subconsciente, domina el mundo. No te lo pierdas. Activa las notificaciones ahora, porque lo que viene puede cambiarlo todo.
Alexander Vance did not become a billionaire CEO of a global conglomerate by making impulsive decisions based on fleeting impressions. His instincts were sharp, yes, honed over decades of boardroom battles and backroom negotiations. But what truly separated him from others was his relentless insistence on verification, the need to observe, analyze, and confirm before acting. And so, after hearing Elena Morales speak flawless Arabic in the lobby, that singular moment of linguistic brilliance ignited something in him. But it wasn't enough to act on just yet, not until he had a full picture of who this woman truly was, not just what she said in a moment of cultural tension, but what she had done consistently, and more importantly, what the world had failed to see in her. So the next morning, while the rest of Stratix Global went about its usual flow of early meetings, high-priority emails, and quarterly review prep, Vance cancelled his calendar, retreated into his private office on the 53rd floor, and began an uncharacteristic deep dive into the HR archives, pulling up Elena's employee file, which, at first glance, was so barebones it almost irritated him. Name, photo, position. Receptionist 2, hire date, 2 years ago. Salary, laughably below industry standard. Annual reviews glowing, written by supervisors who praised her punctuality, problem-solving and communication skills, but who never seemed to connect those dots into something meaningful. And that alone told him everything about how corporate blindness worked, how too often talent like hers was trapped beneath the weight of low expectations and even lower visibility. And it was only when he bypassed the shallow summary pages and dug into the uploaded original resume that he found what he was looking for. A gold mine hidden in plain sight, a document that listed not only a dual bachelor's degree in international relations and linguistics from Columbia University, but also included coursework at the Sorbonne, immersion exchanges in Beijing and Cairo, and volunteer translation work for humanitarian NGOs focused on displaced populations in conflict zones, plus language certifications stamped with top-tier government scores. And if that wasn't enough, there were letters of recommendation attached from professors and former supervisors that used phrases like brilliant mind, born for diplomacy, and future leader of global policy. And Vance leaned back in his chair with a furrowed brow, both impressed and annoyed, not at her but at himself and his organization, for missing her, for allowing someone like Elena to sit behind a front desk while her intellect collected dust like an unused asset in a forgotten vault. And it made him think of all the boardroom pretenders he'd seen over the years, fluent only in self-promotion, and buzzwords, who had been elevated far beyond their merit while someone like Elena remained unacknowledged, so he requested security footage of the previous day, fast-forwarding through hours of mundane lobby traffic until he found the moment in question, the moment when Elena stepped from behind her desk, approached the frustrated Arabic-speaking delegates, and not only addressed them fluently, but de-escalated the entire situation with subtle grace and precise language, her tone confident but respectful, her poise effortless, and what struck him most was how natural she was, not showy, not performative, just grounded and authentic in her ability. And that's when the decision was made. Not an idea, not a plan, but a decision, as permanent and irreversible as any billion-dollar acquisition he'd ever pursued. Because he knew now that Elena Morales was the real thing, the kind of hidden genius that could recalibrate a company's entire global communication strategy, and he wasn't going to let her get away. But how to approach her? How to summon her without overwhelming or alarming her? He needed a test, not of skill, he already believed in her talent, but of mindset, of readiness, of how she handled the unexpected pressure of being pulled into rooms where people saw her not just as a name tag, but as a name. So he instructed his executive assistant to call her up under the vague pretense of reviewing front desk protocol efficiency. And the following afternoon, Elena received the request with a jolt of anxiety. She had never been summoned to the top floor before, and her mind spun with fears. Had she offended someone? Had her conversation with the foreign delegation been considered overstepping? Still, she arrived promptly, hair tied neatly, notepad in hand, dressed in the same quiet professionalism that had helped her blend in all this time. And when she stepped into Vance's vast corner office, all glass, steel, and silence, she stood before the desk with the same posture she held at the front, polite, steady, unassuming, and Vance looked up, gestured for her to sit, and began the conversation with deliberately vague small talk about lobby operations and call metrics, watching her reactions closely, observing the way she didn't fidget or shrink, how she answered with precision but not panic. And then, without warning, he switched languages, asking her in fluent French what her opinion was of the building's multilingual signage, and after a slight pause, she responded just as fluently, noting nuances in French formal address that might be lost on Moroccan versus Quebecois visitors. And Vance smiled, then pivoted to German, questioning her about cultural protocols in corporate greetings, and again Elena answered without hesitation, adjusting her tone, offering anecdotes, even correcting a subtle mistranslation in one of the company's brochures, and then came Mandarin, perhaps her least used tongue. And yet she met the challenge. Head on, speaking with clarity and respectful cadence, even slipping in a proverb to illustrate her point about timing in business introductions, and by the time he leaned back and asked in English, "Why are you at the front desk?" There was no test left to give, no evaluation left to make, only the question that truly mattered, and Eleanor, caught off guard by the shift in tone, hesitated before answering, her voice soft but unwavering. "Because I needed the job." And no one ever looked past the name tag, and those words struck Vance like a truth bomb detonated beneath the fragile assumptions of corporate hierarchy, and he stood, paced for a moment, and then turned back to her, eyes blazing not with judgment, but with resolve, because he now saw her not as an anomaly but as an opportunity, a bridge between worlds, a woman who could lead Stratix Global into an era of cultural intelligence and real diplomacy, not just transactional business. And as he dismissed her with a calm, "Thank you, Elena, I'll be in touch," she left the room confused, unsure, if she had said too much or not enough. But Vance had already opened his laptop, dialing partners in HR, legal, and strategy, clearing budgets, requesting travel itineraries, drafting a job description for a role that didn't yet exist. One, he would build around her, cultural intelligence officer, a hybrid of diplomacy, language, and strategic negotiation. And as the sun dipped below the skyline that night, casting golden reflections across the windows of his empire, Vance sat alone in his office, not reviewing financial projections or merger targets, but envisioning a future where Elena Morales, the woman once confined to the shadows of reception, would step into boardrooms and embassies not as an assistant, but as an authority, and he made one final note in his planner before shutting the lid. Tomorrow, change. Everything. Elena arrived at the Stratix Global building just before sunrise, her heart steady, but her mind reeling, still unsure what to make of the cryptic meeting with Alexander Vance the day before, unsure if it had been a dream, a warning, or some strange, executive ritual she'd unknowingly passed, and as she stepped into the grand lobby, her polished flats echoing against the high-gloss tiles, her breath caught when she saw another woman, young, fresh-faced, clearly new, already sitting at the front desk, wearing the same navy blazer Elena had worn for over 2 years, typing nervously, glancing at her notes, and when their eyes met, the woman smiled awkwardly and said, "Are you... Elena? They told me you'd show me how to route the calls." And Elena blinked, stunned, not because she had been replaced, no, that wasn't what unsettled her, but because no one had told her, and before she could answer, one of the building's security guards she'd spoken to 100 times handed her a sealed black envelope with her name embossed in bold gold letters and said with a conspiratorial wink, "You're moving up, Miss Morales," then turned and walked away, leaving. Her standing amid the slow hum of morning arrivals, feeling as though she were standing at the edge of something massive and invisible, and with trembling fingers she opened the envelope, unfolding a single sheet of thick stationery with clean, commanding typeface. "Report to the 42nd floor at 9 a.m. sharp. We have work to do. AV." And suddenly everything clicked into place. Her replacement wasn't a demotion or dismissal, it was an elevation, a beginning, a door that had opened without warning but exactly on time, and so she took the elevator up, past the departments she'd only ever seen from a distance, past the floors where strategies were shaped and futures were bought and sold. And when she stepped out onto the 42nd floor, the executive level reserved for directors and Vance's closest confidants, she was met not with formality but warmth, as Vance himself opened his office door and gestured her inside with a grin that held both respect and promise, introducing her to a half-circle of suited executives and saying, "Everyone, meet Elena Morales, our newest cultural intelligence officer." And the room responded with a mix of polite claps and curious glances, while Elena stood frozen, the words not yet landing fully. Because that position, Cultural Intelligence Officer, didn't exist, had never existed until now, and it took her several seconds to realize Vance had created an entirely new role around her talents, sculpting a job title from the very DNA of who she was. And when she tried to thank him, her voice barely above a whisper, he cut her off with a quiet but firm statement that would echo in her mind for months. "The world's changing, Elena. It needs people like you. People who understand the language of business and the language of culture." And from that moment on, her life began to accelerate in ways she couldn't have predicted, couldn't have planned for, as her days were no longer spent coordinating room bookings or smiling behind a desk, but immersed in strategic briefings, global consultations, cultural risk analysis, and private jet flights to cities she had only ever read about in textbooks or seen in films, and within weeks she found herself in Shanghai, sitting across from a steel-eyed Chinese technology magnate whose company's merger with Stratix had stalled over unspoken cultural misunderstandings, and with Mandarin smooth as silk, she not only reignited the deal, but earned a rare compliment from the CEO himself, who said, "You speak not just our words, but our hearts." And from there it spiraled into a blur of missions. To Cairo, where she diffused a PR disaster with an Egyptian logistics firm over translation errors that implied disrespect to elders. To Paris, where her fluency in both the language and the etiquette of French diplomacy helped secure a sensitive aerospace collaboration. And to São Paulo, where her knowledge of Brazilian Portuguese, though less polished, still allowed her to facilitate a crucial face-saving compromise between two rival partners who refused to speak English, and in every room, every negotiation, Eleanor didn't just interpret language, she interpreted meaning, reading posture, intonation, subtext, context, building bridges where others only saw gaps, earning the trust of leaders who'd long been weary of American arrogance. And as the months rolled by, her calendar filled with embassies, boardrooms, think tanks, and cultural roundtables, and news of her impact began to ripple through Stratix, at first as whispers of the multilingual woman on the 42nd floor, then full-on admiration, even envy as executives who had once walked past her without acknowledgement now scrambled to include her in their proposals, realizing that her presence brought legitimacy, trust and nuance that no amount of data could replicate. And Vance, ever the quiet observer, watched her transformation with pride, not as a puppeteer, but as an architect who had simply opened the door and stepped aside. And yet through it all Elena remained grounded, never forgetting where she started, often slipping down to the lobby between meetings to check in with the new receptionist, to offer tips, encouragement, and the occasional shared coffee, because that marble front desk, though behind her, was not beneath her. It was her origin, the place where her strength had been forged, her humility intact. And though the media began to take interest, with tech blogs and global leadership sites calling her the polyglot whisperer or Stratix's secret diplomatic weapon, Elena kept her focus on impact, on people, on proving that empathy was not weakness but power in disguise. And, back in her modest apartment at night, she would often sit on the balcony, city lights flickering like stars caught in mid-fall, thinking about her mother, the woman who had once struggled to pay for Elena's books but never stopped believing that her daughter could change the world. And she knew, now more than ever, that she had to keep going. Because this wasn't just her job anymore. It was her mission, her calling, her quiet revolution against every system that told brilliant, multilingual daughters of immigrants that they didn't belong at the table, and she would pull out her old notebooks, still filled with phrases in languages she was mastering, Swahili, Russian, even American Sign Language, because she knew that the more voices she could understand, the more lives she could touch, and what had once been a job behind a desk had become a passport into humanity itself. And she wasn't just building bridges anymore, she was the bridge. Exactly 1 year after she stepped out from behind the reception desk and into the beating heart of global enterprise, Elena Morales stood at the apex of a world stage, the grand auditorium of the Palais des Nations in Geneva, where the World Economic Language and Diplomacy Forum was being held under glistening chandeliers and a ceiling painted in fragments of continents, surrounded by heads of state, CEOs, human rights leaders, linguistic scholars, tech innovators, and press from every continent. And as the final keynote speaker of the event, she now wore a tailored white suit with soft gold trim, the kind of quiet power that radiated authority without screaming for attention, her name etched into the official schedule alongside titans of policy and diplomacy, her podium positioned beneath the flags of 50 nations. And as she took a moment behind the curtains to breathe in the sheer magnitude of what was about to unfold, she scanned the crowd until her eyes found Alexander Vance, seated front and center, his hands folded, that familiar glimmer of pride in his eyes. And she remembered in perfect clarity the day he had overheard her speak Arabic in the lobby, a moment that seemed so distant now it felt like a fable from another lifetime. And yet it was that single spark, that silent recognition of her brilliance, that had shifted the entire tectonic plate of her life. And now, as her name echoed through the massive hall, Elena Morales, Chief Cultural Intelligence Officer of Stratix Global, she stepped forward into a silence that was not absence, but reverence, and when she opened her mouth, it was not in English, but in fluent French, then Spanish, then Arabic, then Mandarin, each transition seamless, not a performance, but a demonstration of what it meant to meet the world where it lives. And she did not merely impress the audience, she invited them gently, powerfully into a new understanding. As she told the story of her journey not as a corporate fairy tale, but as a call to action, a living truth about how language is not just about words, but about being seen, about being heard, and how the world's most overlooked people often hold its most undervalued treasures, sharing that her rise was not a result of luck, but of someone's willingness to listen beyond expectation. And when she shifted back to English, her tone softened, her voice steady but vulnerable as she said, "Too often we judge by roles and titles. We speak of potential, but we don't see it unless it fits a mold. But behind every accent, every silence, every hello from a front desk, there is a story, a skill, a soul worth recognizing. and the weight of her words fell over the audience like sacred truth, cutting through years of bias, bureaucracy, and institutional blindness. And when she finished, there was a heartbeat of stillness before the room erupted into a thunderous standing ovation, world leaders on their feet, reporters scrambling toward the stage, diplomats weeping openly. And for a long moment she stood there in the raw, her eyes glistening but focused, not overwhelmed but fulfilled, not stunned by the applause but steadied by it, because she knew, now that the world hadn't simply discovered her, it had at last believed her. And after the forum, amidst a flurry of interviews and handshakes, Vance approached her with a calm smile and a proposal that would mark the next great chapter of her journey. "I want you to lead a new global division, the Diversity Diplomacy Initiative," he said. "Its mission: find people like you. The ones buried beneath assumptions, the ones the world isn't listening to yet." And without hesitation, without doubt, Elena said yes, not because of the title or the prestige, but because she knew the value of hidden voices, of brilliance. Ignored of rooms where accents became barriers and silence became misinterpretation. And in the months that followed, she built the initiative from the ground up, traveling to underserved communities across 5 continents, visiting universities, refugee programs, bilingual schools, and community centers where children translated. For parents and teens navigated immigration documents in 3 languages before they were old enough to vote, and she created scholarships, mentorship pipelines, internship programs within Stratix and other global firms, pairing young multilingual talents with corporate mentors, tech incubators, and diplomatic attachés, and her face began to appear not only on magazine covers but on Zoom calls with ministers of education, on UN policy panels, and on social media channels run by students who now saw their language skills not as burdens but as gifts. And Elena's name became synonymous with a new kind of leadership, one rooted in listening, empathy, cultural fluency, and vision, not just for business but for how business could honor humanity. And through it all, she never forgot the girl she had once been, the one who sat quietly behind the desk, waiting for someone to see her. And she kept that gold-embossed envelope Vance had once sent her, now framed on her home office wall, a reminder that one act of recognition could change not just a life, but the world. And late at night, when the cities were quiet and her calendar finally cleared, she would still sit on her balcony, sipping tea, reading letters from students in Nairobi, in Bogota, in Manila, thanking her for seeing them, for creating a path where none had existed. And she would smile with a gentle kind of peace, knowing her legacy would not be measured in applause or accolades, but in lives ignited, voices amplified, and silence broken forever, because her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every unseen genius still waiting to be heard. And as she prepared her next speech for the UN General Assembly, drafting lines in Korean and Swahili, she whispered to herself with quiet joy, "This is what it means to change everything, not to climb the ladder, but to rebuild it."